Hello and welcome. I'm Maria Kliavkoff, and I am the author of Healthy Mourning, Happy Loving, and I'm also the founder of Healthy Mourning Revolution, which is dedicated to converting our grief to mourning and teaching the lessons of how to convert our grief to mourning. But more than anything else, it's about helping us to revolutionize the way we think about grief and mourning. And today's topic, Buried and Carried Grief, is all about what happens when we don't revolutionize our thinking, when we stay stuck in grief and we find ourselves bearing and carrying the grief that we've had for years and sometimes even decades. And we do this because we weren't taught how to walk through our grief journey and how to do healthy mourning. So I want to talk about what some of these symptoms are of buried and carried grief, because many of us don't even realize that we're doing it. I know I didn't realize I was doing it, and I was doing it for decades. So what are some of these symptoms that might flag for you that maybe you do have some buried and carried grief on the go? Which, by the way, nothing to be ashamed of, because this is the way society has taught us to deal with our grief, is to march on, to soldier on, and that time heals those wounds, and the reality is time does not heal those wounds. So we want to make sure that we're identifying for ourselves, and then we learn that catch-up mourning is possible, but first we need to identify that we are in fact bearing and carrying our grief. So some of the things you may be experiencing is difficulty in trusting and in intimacy. Now, why would this be? It would be because when we're feeling like we will inevitably feel loss and feel hurt, and we don't want to deal with the kind of grief that we've already experienced and we haven't dealt with it, we've buried and carried it. On the inside, we're looking to protect ourselves, and so we protect ourselves by distancing ourselves, because we know that if we fall in love, we may lose that person, and if that person dies, if we lose that person, that then there's something to fear, and we don't know how to handle it, and the next one might take us out. And if you're having any of those thoughts or any of those feelings, please know it's indicative of buried and carried grief that can be healed. This is the big important piece of the puzzle. It can be healed. Catch-up mourning is absolutely possible, and it is the pathway to healing all of this so that we can find love on the other side. You might have an extended depression or a negative outlook on life, which is quite natural, because over time, like I said, I had decades of this. Over time, if you've been experiencing buried and carried grief, what happens is your life spark, that life force inside of you, begins to dim and dull. And that's that feeling of depression, and that's that negative outlook to life where you're feeling like, well, what's the point? There's no juice here, there's no joy here, and you've lost your joy in living, right? Because that life spark has been diminished. You may be feeling anxiety or even panic attacks, which may look like fatigue or muscle aches or irritability or sleep disturbance, your heart racing, certainly in a panic attack. You might be waking up with panic attacks. You might be easily startled. All of these can be indicative of you bearing and carrying grief and kind of having this unresolved feeling inside, which causes anxiety and fear because it's constantly unresolved inside of you, and your insides know that, right? But we're not allowing that grief inside to surface, and so there's this anxiety against something that you don't even know is there, right? You can also be experiencing psychic numbing or disconnect, and what that looks like is kind of you go through the motions of life, but you don't feel connected in life. You don't feel the joys of life. You feel like it's kind of unreal. Life is unreal somehow. You're going through the motions, but there's no connection to it. There's no feeling of connectedness, and there's no feeling of presence in your life, right? Which can be really debilitating. How can you give your best when you have no connection to the people around you, no connection to your insides, and no joy at offering your best, right? And this is about reclaiming your gifts and reclaiming your joy in living. You may be self-medicating, and self-medicating can look like alcohol or drug abuse. It can look like eating disturbances or disorders. we self-medicate in a myriad of ways, and it's not just limited to these levels of abuse. We self-medicate by zoning out, by becoming a couch potato. A couch potato is kind of a poster child for somebody who just doesn't want to deal with life, and so they're constantly distracting themselves with something other and kind of self-medicating. If I'm looking at this, then I'm not dealing with life. You may also discover that you have physical problems, and the physical problems may be real, or they may be imagined, and they may be chronic and ongoing, and that may also be connected to buried and carried grief. And so it's really important, if you find yourself, or if you think yourself to be bearing and carrying your grief, that you start looking at, well, how can we go beyond this? How can we identify that this is what's going on, and what are the steps that we can take? So in my podcast this week, I'm going to be talking about the steps that you can take if you discovered that you've got some buried and carried grief on the go. And like I said, it would be unusual if you didn't have some buried and carried grief on the go, because we live in a society that encourages us to buck up and move on. We constantly get inundated with buck up and move on messages. So the question is the degree to which you've been bearing and carrying your grief, and the degree to which that has sidestepped your life, because then you're stuck in it. And what we're wanting to make sure of is that you're not stuck in it, that when you identify that you've got some buried and carried grief on the go, that you know how to release yourself from being stuck in your grief, and that you're able to release your grief. So if you're interested in that, please hop on over to our podcast. I'll put the connections in the description below. I also invite you to come and visit us at healthymourning.com for other resources. You can book a free consultation with me. I'd be happy to chat with you. If you think that you've got some buried and carried grief on the go and you're looking for what to do with that, absolutely book a free consultation and let's have a chat. You can also sign up for the free Healthy Mourning Revolution live launch, which is coming up, and we'd be happy to get you hooked up with a concierge there, and we go through 9 days of conversation around this and around healthy mourning, because at the end of the day, that's what we all want to do. We want to learn how to love and learn how to mourn in healthy ways, so that we're not afraid of our grief, but rather we're leaning on our grief and learning from our grief and moving forward in our lives. I wish you much love. I hope you have ease and grace in your grief journey and in the week ahead. Look forward to seeing you next time. Namaste.